Hello everyone, Pravina here. Now we are going to listen to podcast news which includes important editorials. While walking in the morning or evening, while cooking, cycling or during free time you can listen. It will enhance your learning and understanding of various accents and pronunciations. Listening improves the quality of communication and comprehension. Before going ahead, I would like to welcome you all to the virtual school. A new way of learning and teaching, with the vision of let's grow together. Our mission is to learn how to learn and teach how to teach. So stay tuned. And here we go. Editorial 1. Change at the hem. As the BJP seeks to widen its social base, it should avoid the politics of polarization. By unseating B.S. Yediyurappa from the Chief Minister's chair in Karnataka, the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, has set in motion a new strategy for its consolidation in the state. Considering that this change of guard has been in the making for a while, the party must have accounted for the ramifications. The BJP had to change its chief minister in Uttarakhand twice within a span of 4 months recently, pointing to the pitfalls in effecting changes even when they are premeditated. Mr. Yediyurappa is no pushover and remains agile and active even at the age of 78. He has already said he would remain active in politics. At least for now, he has no intention of crossing swords with the central leadership of the party, which gave him the marching orders. But the Lingayat community that he belongs to has left no opportunity to express its displeasure. Community leaders and seers have come out openly in support of the displaced chief minister. Lingayats form the axis of the BJP's social base in Karnataka. Mr. Yediyurappa has been the mastermind of the party's rise in Karnataka and became the party's first chief minister in a southern state in 2008. In 2018, the BJP did not win a majority, but a year later, he undermined the Congress Janata Dal's coalition government by engineering defections. 2 years later, he is handing over the baton, leaving the fate of the defectors in the hands of his successor. The BJP High Command has been wary of strong regional leaders, and Mr. Yediyurappa has given it no reason to relax. His cunning has been a double-edged sword for the party. On the one hand it helped the party's rise, but on the other he used it to consolidate his own personal power. He parted ways with the party once and even went to jail on corruption charges. He has been brazen in promoting a son, B.Y. Vijayendra, in the BJP, and as the inheritor of the Lingayat mantle. The BJP's game plan appears to be to hold the community within its tent, but loosen its grip over power, mimicking its approach to the Patels in Gujarat who had turned the party into a vehicle of their domination until Narendra Modi arrived on the scene. It took a while before the Patels reconciled to their changed status in the BJP. The High Command party that the BJP has become may like to promote a Lingayat leader, though not necessarily as the new chief minister, who will be more compliant to its wishes than Mr. Yediyurappa. A lot will also depend on Mr. Yediyurappa's plans and his command over the Lingayats, once out of power. But the BJP's new strategy should not involve communal polarization, and its new chief minister must refrain from playing competitive Hindutva with other chief ministers of the party. Thank you. Editorial 2. Wounded Mountains tourist tragedy in Himachal Pradesh points to the importance of preserving ecology. The tragic death of 9 tourists in a landslip in Kinnaur district of Himachal Pradesh is another pointer to the fragility of the ecology of the Himalayan states. Extraordinarily heavy rain pummeled the state recently, leaving the hill slopes unstable and causing floods in built-up areas including Dharmashala. The descending boulders from destabilized terrain, which crushed a bridge like a matchstick, are a source of worry even for cautious local residents, and for unwary visitors, such as the tourists traveling in a van, they can turn into sudden disaster. Himachal is famed for its scenic vistas and welcoming summer climate, and drew a few 100,000 tourists in June this year as states began relaxing the controls for COVID-19. There was justified alarm at the prospect of a fresh surge in infections, prompting Chief Minister Jairam Thakur to appeal for COVID-appropriate behavior. Unfortunately, there was not enough vigil against travel to risky areas, in the wake of a disastrous year for tourism, resulting in the mishap in Kinnaur's Besteri area. What should worry Himachal, and neighbouring Uttarakhand, is that the states may be entering a phase of irreversible decline because of losses to their ecology. Frequent landslides may become inevitable. Bootstrapping an incompatible model of development in the hills, represented by big hydroelectric projects and large-scale construction activity involving destruction of forests and damming of rivers, is an invitation to harm. Mega hydropower, which Himachal Pradesh is working to tap as a significant source of green power that substitutes energy from fossil fuels, could alter several aspects of ecology, rendering it vulnerable to the effects of extreme events such as cloudbursts, flash floods, landslides and earthquakes. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on Energy during 2018-19 noted that the state could more than double its existing harnessed hydropower potential of 10,547 MW. Kinnaur is a focus point for such development, centered around the potential of the glacially fed Sutlej Valley, but one scientific estimate warns that avaricious tapping of the river through all planned projects would impound nearly a quarter of its waters in dams, and divert a staggering 72% through tunnels. Other researchers, studying the 2015 Nepal earthquake, point to high seismicity causing fatal landslides and severe damage to hydropower structures in the Himalayas. The cost of power produced was underestimated, while the potential was overestimated. Evidently, it is impossible to assign a real value to the costs to people and communities, together with the loss of pristine forests that weak afforestation programs cannot replace. As catastrophic weather events inflict frequent, heavy losses, Himachal Pradesh and other Himalayan states can only watch their ecological base erode. Changing course may yet preserve a lot of their natural riches. Thank you. Editorial 3. Evaluating India's options in Afghanistan. With the West done with Afghanistan, New Delhi needs to adopt a layered approach in finding a political solution. Stanley Johnny. AFP. It is not a coincidence that the United States is exiting Afghanistan at the same time that the focus of its foreign policy is shifting to East Asia. There is growing consensus in Washington, D.C. that the U.S., instead of staying engaged in the lost wars, which adds little value to American power, should now urgently prepare itself for the unfolding geopolitical contest with China. America's strategic response to China's rise is its Indo-Pacific strategy, which seeks to build a bloc of Indian and Pacific Ocean democracies aimed at containing China's rise and challenging its high-functioning single-party dictatorship. The US wants India to play a key role in this bloc, which along with Australia and Japan, make up the so-called Quad grouping. But there is one problem. India, unlike the other members, is the only continental Asian power in the Quad, which shares a contested land border with China and is vulnerable to the geopolitical changes in the Eurasian landmass. The US may have retreated from Afghanistan as part of a grand strategy to take on China in maritime Asia, in which it needs India's involvement, and India might find it tempting to join the ranks, especially after China's aggression on the line of actual control last year. But the irony is that the American withdrawal and the vacuum it leaves in Afghanistan and continental Asia in general, which is being filled by China and Russia, is reinforcing India's identity as a continental Asian power. Barring a brief interregnum in the 1990s, India has historically enjoyed good ties with Afghanistan, which go back to the 1950 Treaty of Friendship. Indian interests and influence suffered when the Taliban, backed by Pakistan, captured Kabul in 1996. But India was back in action as soon as the Taliban were ousted from power after the US invasion in 2001. It has made huge investments and commitments ever since, which run into over $3 billion, and cultivated strong economic and defense ties with the Afghan government. Now, it is again staring at uncertainty, with the US pullback having effectively changed the balance of power in Afghanistan and the Taliban making rapid territorial gains. The US's strategic objectives in Afghanistan were limited, as US President Joe Biden himself pointed out earlier this month, killing Osama bin Laden and disrupting Al-Qaeda networks. Defeating the Taliban and nation-building were part of the neoconservative ideological project, which has evidently failed. This means, the US, having met its realist objectives, can abandon the Afghan government and exit the theater, which is what Mr. Biden is doing. But India cannot. It has to protect its investments, prevent Afghanistan from becoming another safe haven for anti-India terrorist groups, and also check Pakistan deepening its influence in Kabul. Talking with the Taliban. So what should India do? One option, as many commentators have already pointed out, is to hold talks with the Taliban. India has already established contacts with the Taliban in Doha. Talking to them would allow New Delhi to seek security guarantees from the insurgents in return for continued development assistance or other pledges. In the 1990s, India had backed the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance, as well as explored the possibility of the Taliban's autonomy from Pakistan. At this point, talking to the Taliban looks inevitable. But India should not overlook the deep ties between Pakistan's security establishment and the Haqqani network, a major faction within the Taliban that's driving the successful campaigns on the battlefield. The US overlooked it while fighting the Taliban along with Pakistan, and it paid a heavy price for it. There is no guarantee that India's quest for engagement with the Taliban would produce a desirable outcome. So India should broad-base its options. While talking to the Taliban to protect its interests, New Delhi should also enhance aid to Afghanistan's legitimate government and security forces and work with other regional powers for long-term stability in the country. Kabul versus the Taliban. True, the Taliban now control or contest most of Afghanistan's countryside. But still, it is not a foregone conclusion that they could take Kabul easily. The Afghan military has some 200,000 battle-hardened soldiers, including the highly trained special forces. In the cities, which saw relative freedoms and rights compared to the dark period of the Taliban regime, the government, despite its infighting, corruption and incompetence, still commands support. There is no Northern Alliance this time. The Taliban have already taken northern districts, including Badakhshan and Taka. The only force that is standing up to the Taliban is the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. India should urgently step up training Afghan forces and provide military hardware, intelligence and logistical and financial support so that Kabul can continue to defend the cities. New Delhi should also coordinate with other regional powers to support the Afghan government, because if the government forces crumble before the Taliban, the prospects for a political settlement would be narrowed. Why should a winning Taliban make concessions? Regional solution. There is a convergence of interests between India and three key regional players, China, Russia and Iran, in seeing a political settlement in Afghanistan. These three countries have already opened public, direct talks with the Taliban. But these contacts are largely tactical in nature. For China, whose restive Xinjiang province shares a border with Afghanistan, a jihadist-oriented Taliban regime would not serve its internal interests. Russia, which fears that instability would spill over into the former Soviet republics, has already moved to secure its Central Asian perimeter. For the Shia theocratic Iran, a Sunni Deobandi Taliban with which it had almost gone to war in 1998, will continue to remain an ideological, sectarian and strategic challenge. None of these countries would like to see the Taliban taking over Kabul militarily, which means there would be an isolated Sunni Islamist regime in a country with fractured ethnic equations. There would neither be legitimacy for a Taliban regime nor peace in Afghanistan. India, to break this impasse, should take a layered approach. Its immediate goal should be the safety and security of its personnel and investments. The long-term goal should be finding a political solution to the crisis. And if a political solution is not achieved, it should seek non-conventional methods, like what it did in the 1990s to offer support to its allies within Afghanistan and retain some influence. None of this can be achieved unless it works together with the regional powers. Russia has cultivated links with the Taliban in recent years. India would need Russia's support in any form of direct engagement with the Taliban. When it comes to Afghanistan, Iran is an irreplaceable country. It shares a long border with Afghanistan and has built contacts through several stakeholders in the country, especially the ethnic minorities. The original objective of India's Chabahar project in Iran was to create a direct access to Afghanistan, bypassing Pakistan. This direct access is critical for India in all different scenarios: move supplies to Kabul in larger quantities, retain its presence in the event of a civil war, or carry out covert operations if the Taliban take power by force. But India, under pressure from the US, slowed down on the Chabahar connectivity projects, which finally prompted Iran to drop India and go ahead. Building strategic ties with Iran, irrespective of the US's policy towards the Islamic Republic, is essential for India's Afghan bets. Finally, India should talk with China, with the objective of finding a political settlement and lasting stability in Afghanistan. Central to this approach is India striking the right balance between its continental realities and the US's pivot to maritime Asia. The US, and the West in general, are done with Afghanistan. India, as one of the countries that would be impacted by the consequences of American withdrawal, has to work with European powers to protect its interests and stabilize Afghanistan. Thank you. Editorial 4. An immigration bill that does not go far enough. The new bill is better than the Immigration Act 1983, but more reforms are needed to protect Indian workers. Nikhil Eban. Getty Images iStock photo. ASEAN Delight. Getty Images iStock photo. In early June 2021, the Ministry of External Affairs invited public inputs to the Immigration Bill 2021, https://bit.ly/2vervx and https://bit.ly/2:. The bill could be introduced in Parliament soon and presents a long overdue opportunity to reform the recruitment process for nationals seeking employment abroad. Exploitative conditions. For years, Independent investigations into migrant worker conditions have underlined serious exploitative practices which include large recruitment charges, contract substitution, deception, retention of passports, non-payment or underpayment of wages, poor living conditions, discrimination and other forms of ill treatment. In recent months, media reports have highlighted how the majority of migrant worker deaths in the Arab Gulf states, West Asia, are attributed to heart attacks and respiratory failures, whose causes are unexplained and poorly understood. Labor migration is governed by the Immigration Act, 1983. https://bit.ly/3i4gfvd and https://bit.ly/2vcjm6s, which sets up a mechanism for hiring through government-certified recruiting agents, individuals or public or private agencies. It outlines obligations for agents to conduct due diligence of prospective employers, sets up a cap on service fees, and establishes a government review of worker travel and employment documents, known as immigration clearances, to 18 countries mainly in West Asian states and Southeast Asian countries. https://bit.ly/2wmmfhp. Improvements, drawbacks. The Immigration Bill 2021 is an improvement over the 1983 Act. It launches a new immigration policy division, establishes help desks and welfare committees, requires manpower agencies to conduct pre-departure briefings for migrants, and increases accountability of brokers and other intermediaries who are also involved in labor hiring. But the bill does not go far enough. First, the 2021 bill's purpose, to consolidate and amend the law relating to immigration of citizens of India, lacks a human rights framework aimed at securing the rights of migrants and their families. Progressive labor regimes do so. For example, in a country such as the Philippines, it explicitly recognizes the contributions of Filipino workers and the dignity and fundamental human rights and freedoms of the Filipino citizens. Another significant drawback is that the bill permits manpower agencies to charge workers service fees, and even allows agents to set their own limits. International labor standards such as International Labour Organization, ILO, Private Employment Agencies Convention No. 181 and the ILO General Principles and Operational Guidelines for Fair Recruitment recognizes that it is employers, not workers, who should bear recruitment payments including the costs of their visas, air travel, medical exams, and service charges to recruiters. Large-scale surveys by the ILO and the World Bank show that Indian workers pay exorbitant charges for their jobs and that poorer workers pay progressively larger fees. Indians in Saudi Arabia paid on average $1,507 in recruitment charges. Their counterparts in Qatar paid $1,156. https://bit.ly/3zzxlxh. To some, recruitment charges might appear like a justified service fee, but the tens of thousands of rupees that workers pay far exceed the real cost of recruitment. When low-wage migrants pick up the tab, it makes them vulnerable to indebtedness and exploitation. Worker-paid recruitment fees eat into their savings, force them to take high-interest loans, live on shoestring budgets, and in the worst cases of abuse, leave workers in situations of debt bondage, a form of forced labor. But perhaps the bill's most glaring inclusion is that it permits government authorities to punish workers by cancelling or suspending their passports and imposing fines up to 50,000 rupees for violating any of the bill's provisions. When enforced, it can be used as a tool to crack down on workers who migrate through unregistered brokers or via irregular arrangements such as on tourist visas. Criminalizing the choices migrant workers make either because they are unaware of the law, under the influence of their recruiters, or simply desperate to find a decent job is deplorable, runs contradictory to the purpose of protecting migrants and their families, and violates international human rights standards. Recruiters and public officials could misuse the law to instill fear among workers and report or threaten to report them. Migrants in an irregular situation who fear that they could be fined or have their passports revoked are also less likely to make complaints or pursue remedies for abuses faced. Scant gender dimensions. This bill does not also adequately reflect the gender dimensions of labor migration, where women have limited agency in recruitment compared to their counterparts and are more likely to be employed in marginalized and informal sectors and/or isolated occupations in which labor, physical, psychological, and sexual abuse are common. The bill also provides limited space for worker representation or civil society engagement in the policy and welfare bodies that it sets up. To ensure that labor recruitment works for the tens of thousands of Indian women and men who migrate outside our borders each year, the Ministry of External Affairs must start at the top and draft a clearer purpose which explicitly recognizes the contributions of Indian workers, the unique challenges they face, and uphold the dignity and human rights of migrants and their families. Then it must address the specific provisions that diverge from this purpose. Nikhil Eapen is a freelance journalist and researcher at Equidem, a labor rights non-governmental organization. Thank you. Editorial 5. Did Orange counter saffron in Karnataka? The Lingayat Mutt's influence and their heterogeneity have been a tough nut for the BJP to crack. In solidarity, seers from the Lingayat community gathering to show support for Karnataka Chief Minister B.S. Yediyurappa in Bangalore on Sunday. Tipti. Why was it so difficult, but necessary, for the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, to retire an old warhorse such as B.S. Yediyurappa? After all, he clearly defied all that the party publicly stands for. He shows no distaste for engaging in old-style corruption, and has even paid the price for it. He makes no bones about extending his rule by next of kin in promoting the de facto power of B.Y. Vijayendra. But above all, he showed a degree of fairness to the Muslim population of the state, approximately 13%, when he categorically stated, at the height of the pandemic in 2020, that no one should say a word against Muslims. This is a warning. Such fairness is quite alien to many other members of the party, which obliges its members to foster a hatred of Muslims. His warning flew against the successful ethnic profiling of Muslims following the Tablighi meeting at Nizamuddin Markaz in March 2020. Naturally, it only earned him greater displeasure. He has symbolically ended 2 years of a troubled time as Karnataka's chief minister in a blaze of advertisements recounting his achievements. As he counts his days to the Mer Darshak Mandal, or to a safe sinecure elsewhere, Mr. Yediyurappa has revealed his capacity to rally support from the local men in Orange, the Mathadishas, head of Mutts, of several Lingayat, and a few other Mutts, of which Karnataka has a dense and active network. Small groups meeting in his support coalesced into a gathering of about 450 who convened at Bangaluru's Palace grounds on Sunday. Generous grants. Mr. Yediyurappa had inaugurated his last victory in 2008 with generous grants to these Mutts. Between 2008 and 2013, the BJP government had granted at least 152 rupees crore to 20 named institutions. In his new, though illegitimately obtained, time in power, he steered Karnataka's decades-long legacy of development in completely new directions through the creation of caste-based development corporations, one of which was the Veershaiva Lingayat Development Corporation that was endowed with 500 rupees crore last year. Mr. Yediyurappa made development all about caste. But did the men in orange come out on the streets of Karnataka to express their gratitude for this largesse? The public engagements of the Mutts, particularly in the world of education, have been about a century in the making, when Lingayat Mutts first began to build institutions to serve those of their own caste, and later, a much larger community of Kannadigas. From the 1970s they have expanded their educational engagements to set up professional colleges and related facilities. Today, for instance, the Jagadguru Shri Shivratrishwara, JSS, group of institutions number close to 350 educational institutions, while the Shri Siddhaganga Mutt at Tumkur has an enviable 125. To add to their institutional strength, there has been an increased involvement of Mutts and Mathadishas in all parts of Karnataka in the developmental works of their regions. This may range from building bridges and irrigation works. They are even involved in establishing a balance between new livelihoods and ecological sustainability. For example, making iron ore mining companies in Chitradurga more accountable to the communities that they have thoroughly ravaged. The Karnataka Mutts have been, as M. Kalburge so well described it, an unauthorized government. Wielding a moral, rather than a legal authority, Mathadishas of especially the Lingayat Mutts have long established themselves as the arbiters of everyday life in Karnataka. What of their engagement with the world of electoral politics? It could consist of nudging adherents towards a particular candidate. Former Karnataka Chief Minister S. Nidlingappa was a victim of this process. Participating in public protests became common as Mathadishas and political representatives together demanded other backward class, OBC, reservation for the Vokkaligas and the Lingayats in the late 1980s. In 2017, they demanded separate religious status for the Lingayats. This engagement has gone further today. Attempts are being made to reduce the cacophony and expense of electoral politics, particularly in local body elections, by urging electorates to, unanimously, choose one or another candidate, who then wins without a contest. This does not bode well for a democracy, but reveals the Mutts' formidable local political power. Current assertion. What of the current assertion by the men in orange in support of Mr. Yediyurappa or another Lingayat leader? Is it to enlarge the powers they already enjoy, free of the accountability of the elected representative? Or has the promised, double-engine Sarkara, in fact, shown signs of disobediently pulling in a direction quite opposed to the union government? Ironically, the power of the Mathadishas, strengthened no doubt by the wider political climate that privileges all men in orange, may precisely be that which undermines the homogenizing Hindutva project. It was the dangerous threat to Hindu unity that was exposed in the 2017 campaign for the recognition of the Lingayats as belonging to a separate religion, a demand that was successfully beaten back, at least temporarily, by the union government. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chief Minister were able to get away with yoking Sanatana, eternal or absolute dharma, to Pratipara, progressive, when inaugurating the renovations to Anubhava Mantapa at Basvakalyan in Bidar, a move that sent up a futile cry of protest among those who saw this as a contradiction of Basva's ideals. But again, It was the radical heterogeneity of the mutts that came into public display for 3 months after January 2021, when the Matadishas of a subsect of the Lingayats, the Panchamsali Lingayats, marched towards Bangalore, demanding a rearrangement of reservation categories to better represent their subcaste. Mr. Yediyurappa was himself besieged in this war that broke out between the castes and subcastes. The second wave of COVID-19 arrived as a grotesque succor, but he still had to claw back the dangerous tilt in power towards the men in orange when he physically wrapped the wrist of Vachananda Swamy, after the latter publicly asked him to accommodate more Panchamsali Lingayats in his cabinet. We have, therefore, witnessed the contradictory process by which the unity that the union government strives for is continually undermined by the fractious struggles of the region and its castes. Karnataka's Matadishas, whom no political party can do without, are a mixed bunch. Some, such as the then Nidumamidi Swamy and the current Nijgunananda Swamy, have publicly campaigned against the BJP's communal politics. Their commitment to their caste ironically staved off the precipitous plunge towards the Uttar Pradesh model, which other members of the party have eagerly embraced. For some time, Baswatava's orange may well run counter to Hindutva's saffron. Janki Nair taught modern Indian history at the Centre for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. Thank you. Editorial 6. Derelice, Ertuğrul is more than just a Turkish delight. Turkey's influence through its TV show has not waned. As Turkey's geopolitical and regional ambitions grow, its soft power influence through its most popular television export, Derelice, Ertuğrul, Resurrection, Ertuğrul, does not seem to wane. Recently, its first publicly owned floating liquefied natural gas, LNG, storage and regasification vessel, also named Ertuğrul Gazi, was inaugurated. Present at this event, which would enable the country to cover much of its energy needs, was President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Returning to its Islamic roots and re-establishing the Ottoman glory have been a top priority for Mr. Erdoğan and his AK party. Hence, last September, while commemorating the 739th death anniversary of Ertuğrul Gazi, he reiterated the goal of preserving Anatolia as a homeland. Ertuğrul reflects that ambition for prestige and national assertion. Produced by Turkish Radio and Television Corporation, TRT, the national broadcaster, this historical extravaganza, set in the 13th century, has been inspired by the life of Ertuğrul Gazi, whose son, Sultan Usman, became the first caliph of the Ottoman Empire. His heroic acts managed to capture the hearts of billions of viewers across 72 countries and became popularly known as the Muslim Game of Thrones. Mr. Erdoğan, a great proponent of this show, has been playing an active leadership role in the Islamic world, whether it is in Afghanistan, supporting Bangladesh with regard to the Rohingya issue, aiding Azerbaijan against Armenia, or extending its presence in North Africa. For someone who has been modeling himself as an Ottoman Sultan, a drama series like Ertuğrul is an effective communication vehicle. In 2019, Turkey, Pakistan and Malaysia had proposed setting up a television channel to promote Muslim heroes and counter Islamophobia. While that did not take off, the following Ramzan, Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan recommended the show to his youth. Soon, a quarter of the global audience were Pakistanis, and by July 2021, Pakistan Television Corporation's PTV YouTube channel gained 14.9 million subscribers. Extending beyond its political leadership, the Turkey-Pakistan Brotherhood is witnessed across shops and hotels in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Gilgit-Baltistan, where the two flags fly together. Recently, Bangladeshis turned fans after some Bengali dubbed episodes became available. The Turkish ambassador there, Mustafa Osman Turan, after visiting Deep Tone, the popular private TV channel, said such shows would help bring two fraternal countries together. Meanwhile, Deep Tone has planned to purchase the series. Incidentally, Bangladesh has become the fourth largest arms buyer from Turkey, reportedly receiving weapons worth about $60 million in the first quarter of 2021. The historical conquests of the hero have also resonated with Kashmiris in India. In May 2020, ATRT official tweeted that more Indians searched for these videos on YouTube than for Shah Rukh Khan. Many parents in Kashmir have even chosen to name their newborns Ertugrul, and a restaurant in downtown Srinagar is themed around it. In August 2020, Azerbaijan became a major gas supplier in Turkey. A month later, the latter supported the former after intense fighting broke out between Azerbaijan and Armenia. During this time, it was also announced that Ertugrul would be dubbed in the Azeri language and aired on its state television channel, AZTV. However, not the entire Muslim world has taken to it. In a bid to curb Turkey's soft power influence, some religious organizations in Egypt and Saudi Arabia called for a ban. Saudi Arabia, which holds a grudge against the Ottomans, launched a big-budget production titled Mamalik El-Nar, Kingdoms of Fire, that has not caused any ripple. The popularity of Ertugrul is in a way reflective of Turkey's growing influence around the world, including Venezuela, where Mr. Erdogan shares a warm relationship with President Nicolas Maduro. Mr. Maduro not only endorsed the series but also visited the sets during his trip to Turkey in 2018. For now, it seems that wherever Mr. Erdogan goes, Ertugrul follows. With the christening of an LNG vessel, it wouldn't be wrong to assume that Ertugrul, which has become a symbol of Turkish power, has expanded beyond being a historical hero to other critical sectors of its society and economy. At the inauguration, Mr. Erdogan said his government was determined to ensure a more prosperous life for each one of its 84 million citizens. Nitya Subramanian is an editor at the Institute of South Asia Studies, ISIS, an autonomous research institute at the National University of Singapore, NUS. Thank you. Editorial 7. Yet another colonial legacy. India's regulatory regime needs a radical overhaul. Pulapre Balakrishnan. A recent event in Kerala, though far from the industrial centers of India, may hold a clue to understanding the malaise crippling the nation's industry. This event took the form of one of the state's major employers making a much publicized investment outside Kerala. What is unusual about this is that the company had earlier announced that it would make an even larger investment within the state itself. The negative publicity given to its departure by the company was considered unnecessary by the state government, and experts have pointed out that the original promise of investing this larger amount in the state is incredible, as its volume is several times the firm's market capitalization. The investor, however, announced that he had been hounded out by the regulatory authorities. Independently, journalists have confirmed that the company's premises had been subjected to 11 inspections in 1 month by the concerned government departments, and its CEO had stated on public television that he had been charged with over 70 compliance failures following these. In a swift move, Kerala's Minister for Industries appeared on public television, where he opened himself to questioning. He stated categorically that the inspections had been in response to alleged violation of human rights and labor laws by the company, and that they had not been ordered by the Industries Ministry of the state. We have no reason to disbelieve him, but are left wondering about the legitimacy of a regulatory arrangement under which the elected government of the day has no say on inspections, even if some of them are related to court rulings. The picture of an ungoverned bureaucracy that emerges from this incident is breathtaking in its implication for the kind of democracy that we are living in. But it is not difficult to see where this originates from. It was the governance model during colonial rule in India. In an insightful commentary on his compatriots of the East India Company, the economist Adam Smith had observed that their only concern was to build a fortune by any means and to get out of the country as fast as possible, no matter what the consequences for its inhabitants. However, even this understanding of the rationale of colonialism is not enough to appreciate its debilitating consequences for India. To hold India, the British invented an intermediary class standing between themselves and the natives. For the latter, there was no redress against the depredations of this class, whose excesses the colonial regime tolerated as a small price for retaining their colony. Crippling effect. The colonial administrative apparatus has been retained intact in independent India. Of course, this was not inevitable. The toxic measures that enslaved Indians could have been removed forthwith, but for reasons that are not difficult to comprehend, India's political class kept them. Now, it has the Supreme Court asking why stick with a sedition law that had been used to immobilize Indians. While many understand the absurdity of the sedition law today, and the more aware among them can see how it kills our democracy, the crippling effect of colonial practices that govern economic activity have gone unscrutinized. Random inspection of a company's premises by state functionaries sits at their pinnacle, preventing India's industry from achieving its potential. On the 30th anniversary of the economic reforms, a puzzle that needs resolution is that while they have been focused on the manufacturing sector, the manufacturing sector has not expanded relative to the economy. Its share has remained quite the same. We may just have received a clue from Kerala to comprehend this outcome. While the elegantly crafted trade and industry reforms have addressed the policy regime, they have not addressed the conditions under which production takes place in this country. This may have held back investment, standing in the way of the expansion of the manufacturing sector as intended. India's regulatory regime needs a radical overhaul. Pulapre Balakrishnan teaches economics at Ashoka University, Sonipat, Haryana. Thank you. 50 years ago, 27 July 1971, graves for blacks not yet dead. A black New York criminal court judge who returned from a visit to South Africa has said that he saw dozens of news graves of South African black infants and 62 open graves waiting for those expected to die of malnutrition. The judges, Mr. William Booth, talked to UN committees inquiring into South Africa's racial separation practices. He said he saw the new and expectant graves in a cemetery for blacks in the Dimbaja area. He also told of visiting a prison for blacks, which the authorities called one of the best, where he found 35 to 40 inmates crowded into a 30 by 30 cell, where they are expected to live for 10 to 15 years. He said in Dimbaja, described as a settlement for 7,000 blacks in the southern part of the republic, 50% of all children born there die of malnutrition before they are 1 year of age. Parents decorate their sorry little graves with milk bottles, rattles and toys so they will be happy in death as they were unhappy in life. 100 years ago, 27 July 1921, City Tenants Protection Bill. A bill entitled, The Madras City Tenants Protection Bill, is published for information in the current, 4th Street, George Gazette. The following is the statement of objects and reasons. In many parts of the city of Madras, dwelling houses and other buildings have, from time to time, been erected by tenants on land belonging to others in the full expectation that, subject to payment of a fair ground rent, they would be left in undisturbed possession notwithstanding the absence of any specific contract as to the duration of the lease or the terms on which the buildings were to be erected. Recently, steps taken to evict a large number of such tenants have shown that such expectations are likely to be defeated. The tenants, if they are evicted, can at the best only remove the superstructures. Congested parts of the city will become more congested. It is reasonable that the landlords, when they evict the tenant, should pay for and take the buildings. There may, however, be cases where the landlord is unwilling to eject a tenant if he can get a fair rent for the land. The bill provides for the payment of compensation to the tenant in case of ejectment to the value of any buildings which may have been erected by him. It also provides for the settlement of a fair rent at the instance of the landlord. Thank you. Faith. Madhu and Kaitbha. When Lord Narayana asked Brahma to create the world, Brahma became very proud of himself. To teach him a lesson, the Lord made two asuras, Madhu and Kaitbha, emerge from his ears, said V.S. Karunkaracharya in a discourse. The two asuras stole the Vedas from Brahma. Without the Vedas, Brahma could not create. The two asuras had inadvertently uttered a Bijakshara in the Durga mantra, and so Durga said they could ask for a boon. They requested that they should die only if they wanted to. Durga granted them their wish. Because of Durga's boon, it became difficult to destroy them. Lord Narayana fought them for 1,000 years, but the fight was inconclusive. Lord Narayana complimented them and said they fought well, and he could give them a boon. But they were so arrogant that they told the Lord that they were powerful enough to grant him boons. So, the Lord said he wanted them both to die. They had not anticipated this. So, they said that if the Lord's promise to give them a boon was still on, then they would like to make use of it. The Lord assured them that his offer was still very much there. They then said they wanted to be killed by him, but this killing had to take place only in a place where there was no water. The world had not taken shape fully, because Brahma had not commenced his job of creation. The world was covered fully with water. So, the asuras had assumed that killing them where there was no water would be impossible. The Lord took the huge form of Hayagriva, placed the two asuras on his thigh, and slapped them hard, crushing them in one blow. His hands became coated with the fat from their bodies. The Lord rubbed this off on the earth. The earth came to be known as Medini, because Midas, in Sanskrit, means fat. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this video as a podcast. Do like, share and comment. Press the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to get new notifications. Thank you. Take care and stay safe. God bless you all. Jai Maa Bharti. To download news and editorials in MP3, follow us on Telegram, Virtual School Official. The link is provided in the description below.